I heard someone from the engine room calling my name. However, nobody ought to have been present. The recollection still terrifies me. The echo of my own voice shouting back was blended with the ship's low mechanical hum, which vibrated through my chest. I'm not sure if the Mariner's Veil was already alive in ways that passengers couldn't comprehend, or if I only dreamed it. I'm 32-year-old Caleb Hunter, a Tampa, Florida-based marine biologist. Even though I work as an ocean researcher, I was on a luxury cruise, which is quite different from what I usually do. My therapist had advised me to take a vacation to help me process the loss of my fiancée, even though I hadn't wanted the diversion. The trip appealed to me because it promised privacy, spacious decks, an infinite supply of water, and the assurance that no one would snoop on my sorrow. I'm a cautious, shy person who picks up on things that others miss. I don't usually hang out in crowds, but the Mariner's Veil's immensity and hum drew me in. The ship appeared harmless on the first evening. Neon lights created the dependable glow of opulence. The dining hall stank of cooked meat and garlic, and passengers joked around the promenade deck. I walked by myself, feeling the ocean's faint wobble beneath the hull and listening to the engine's constant pulse beneath my feet. However, there were subtle, nearly undetectable clues that unnerved me. An open door that ought to have been secured. One shoe, facing away from the room it belonged to, abandoned in the middle of a hallway. I attributed it to the human element of vacationers being thoughtless and forgetting what deck they were on. The elevator was the scene of the first incident. I was on my way back from the observation deck late at night, the glass walls reflecting the stars overhead. The elevator halted at deck 3 when I pushed the button for deck 7, leaving the cabin in an odd crimson hue with the doors open and no one inside. Here, the sound of the engines was more intense, vibrating and echoing as though the ship were breathing. I went outside. The hallway was longer than it ought to have been and extended unnaturally. The elevator was gone when I turned around. The emergency phone line was dead. The doors were sealed, and I couldn't get through when I called. I tried to make sense of what I saw as I moved down the hallway. Tight, metallic, with a little salty and oil scent. Then, like fingernails on steel, I heard a faint, sporadic scratching sound. I went cold. Even though the hallways were deserted, something or someone was moving just out of view. I yelled, my voice muffled against the walls and lost in the vibrations of the buzzing engine. Nothing. By the third night, the events became more intense. When I wasn't looking, things moved. When I left a towel in my cabin, it would be wet even though I had left it dry, and the next moment it would be on the floor or hanging on the balcony railing. I started to hear garbled voices coming from the vents, passengers, and crew, and it didn't make sense. It was like echoes from memories that weren't mine. Sometimes it was laughter, and other times it was quiet tears. I made the decision to look into it, noting specifics in a little notepad. Every door, hatch, and corridor became a part of the mental map that I sketched every night and then redrew. But there was something off about the engine rooms. As though the ship itself were speaking via the vibration of steel, they throbbed with a resonance that wasn't mechanical. My curiosity triumphed over my trepidation on the fourth night. With my heart pounding, I snuck past the restricted notice and entered the engine corridor. The air smelled of diesel and something coppery that I couldn't place, and it was heavy and humid. It was a deafening low hum. Then I heard a voice, a small, persistent one. Caleb. I stopped. There shouldn't have been anyone else present. The only sounds were the voice calling my name, the distant creak of the hull, and the engines. On the back of my neck, the hairs stood up. I was unable to leave even though I wanted to. I was driven on by something to go farther into the maze of pipes and equipment. I saw the first abnormality at that point. A shadow darted just out of my flashlight's field of view, bucking the tight hallway's current. It wasn't a human. Its shape was incorrect. It was lengthy and nearly liquid, and when I looked at it closely, it vanished. Then I saw faint traces on the walls, handprints pressed into the metal, not new, not old, but stamped, as if the ship remembered every person who had ever set foot here. The scratching started up again, more rhythmic and louder. A tiny metal hatch that I had never seen on the blueprints was then revealed by a flash of light above me. It was open a little. My chest throbbed as the hum altered, becoming higher and vibrating more intensely. Additionally, I heard voices I recognized calling names I didn't know, whispering stories of disappearances and warnings I didn't fully comprehend coming from inside the hatch. With my flashlight shaking in my fingers and my heart pounding, I descended. The engine hum resonated in my skull's bones as the air grew cooler. I sensed someone watching, waiting, and being patient. And I caught a glimpse of it in the dull red light of the maintenance bay below a pale, motionless figure that was staring at me from the corner of the chamber. It vanished with a single step. The itching completely stopped after 2 steps. Heavy, smothering silence. "Do not follow or stay forever." Something murmured in my head, and I knew with a shudder that made my blood freeze that the Mariner's Veil was more than just a ship. It knew. It recalled. It was also ravenous for inquiry and attention. The Mariner's Veil felt different the following day. Vibrating through the ceiling, walls, and floor, the engine's hum was more intense and nearly sentient. I tried to forget about the pale person I had seen as I strolled around the promenade deck. Unaware of the faint fear that gnawed at my brain, the passengers yelled and laughed. I convinced myself it was exhaustion, sadness, or paranoia, but my notepad contained proof to the contrary. I made my way back to the engine room corridor around mid-afternoon. The corridor was longer than it should have been, with light rust stains curving like veins and walls that glinted with dampness. Almost like a heartbeat, the emergency lights blinked in a purposeful sequence. With my flashlight and notebook in hand, I pushed ahead until I heard the scratching once more. First slow, then frenzied, pacing the walls in a rhythmic manner as if someone or something were pacing just beyond of my line of sight. I arrived at the maintenance hatch that I had previously observed. The metal was almost unbelievably cold. I pushed it open with a shaking palm, and a flood of moist metallic air came out. "Caleb," the voice said again, softly, almost enticingly. As I descended, I was taken to a place I never would have thought possible by the steep spiral staircase. A tiny maintenance bay with pipes running across the ceiling and red emergency lights reflecting on water puddles. In the corner, a wet and battered notebook drew my flashlight's attention. I grabbed it. Names of passengers who had boarded long before me were scattered across the pages. While some of the names were decades old, others were more recent. The words "gone" were scrawled next to each one. "Never seen again." I shuddered. I realized that the ship had a record. It recalled. It gathered. I heard footsteps behind me. I whirled, my flashlight piercing the darkness, but nothing moved. I froze as I retreated toward the hatch as a murmur, blended with several voices, reverberated across the chamber. Curiosity brings you closer. Curiosity binds you here. The long, liquid-like shadows moved around the walls. I had glimpses of silently waiting figures, some human, some not. Then the buzz sharpened and the air grew colder. My ears throbbed with my own heartbeat. There was something in my way as I dashed back toward the spiral staircase. At the bottom, the pallid person from before stood still. Its lips twitched, mouthing words I couldn't understand, and its eyes were attentive but hollow. When I held up my flashlight, the creature vanished. Above me, the hatch slammed shut with a faint metallic clatter. I was in a panic. I clambered upward, the slender staircase winding longer than it ought to have. When I got to the top, I staggered into the hallway. It had a similar but distinct appearance. The walls were slippery with dampness. The lights flickered red and white, and the smell was metallic and polluted by an unidentified substance. In search of light, air, and a familiar sight, I dashed in the direction of the observation deck. There was no one on the deck. Thick, strange fog came in from the ocean. Here, through the floors, the noise of the motors seemed to be louder. Then I noticed it. Tiny asymmetrical tracks in the fog, moving toward the bow, coming and going. With a pounding heart, I followed them. I turned out of instinct when I heard a faint murmur from the fog. "Do not look back." The railings were bent and the deck was too long, making turns impossible. Through the mist, barely perceptible shapes that were both human and warped flew. Some, their faces colorless and blank, reached for me, their hands glistening in the mist. I wanted to cry out, but I couldn't. The tapping abruptly came back, this time more loud and metallic, reverberating through the deck. It was counting, not random. Slow, methodical, a beat that mirrored my heartbeat. At that moment, I understood that the ship did more than simply glide across the sea. It twisted reality for those it chose to trap by moving through space, memory, and time. I was astonished when I heard a calm, almost robotic voice say, "All passengers, please return to your cabins immediately, over the PA." However, the hallways behind me were different. Doors that I had previously passed now led to nothing. Some swung open into the unending blackness, while others were locked. Unnaturally, the fog on the deck swirled, becoming faces, silently opening lips and murmuring names. In the hopes of seeing personnel or other passengers, I retreated inside the observation lounge, but it was deserted. There was an open journal on a table. The final entry, "The ship remembers," caught my attention. It's living. It is nourished by curiosity. Never go it alone. A slow, methodical scratching sound came from behind me. I turned to see shadows moving toward me like liquid, slithering along the floor. The tapping intensified as the fog grew thicker. I dashed into the living room and headed for the staircase leading to Deck 7. I didn't get much sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the window's reflections, shapes, shifting behind me, hollow eyes that watched all the time. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started to grasp the rules. The ship was nourished with attention. You were chained by fear. The Mariner's Veil also showed patience. Please take a moment to subscribe to Midnight Outcry if you're listening. It helps preserve stories like these. Be careful though, because the same curiosity that makes you want to observe might also keep the ship up at night, anticipating its next visitor. By daybreak, I was certain that whatever was haunting this ship wasn't just in the maintenance hallways or engine room. It was all over, patient, and I was at a loss for what to do. By the third night on board the Mariner's Veil, the ship began to seem more like a cage than a ship. The buzz of the engines was no longer background noise. Instead, it was a pulse, an incessant throbbing that reverberated through my skull, and every hallway twisted differently than it had the day before. It was as though the ship had moved while I was asleep, making my berth appear far away and inaccessible. I held onto my flashlight like a lifeline while I wandered the hallways for hours. I tried to stay away from mirrors because every reflection seemed off. Occasionally, I would see a familiar but hollow face standing behind me, and when I turned around, nothing was there. Sometimes the contours of the shadows suggested human form, but otherwise they spread along walls like smoke. I sensed their constant waiting and calculation. When I tried to get back to the observation deck, the first obvious danger struck. I had never seen a spiral staircase in the ship's drawings until a panel along the railing swung open. I went down, driven by a mix of curiosity and horror. The stairway led down into an area that shouldn't have been there. Pipes twisting inexplicably, water flowing in time with the tapping I'd heard in the engine room, narrow, dark, and slippery with moisture. My stomach turned when the hatch at the bottom opened into a room. It contained hundreds of carefully placed life jackets, yet each one had a name written in a handwriting that was known to the wearer. Names of everyone who have sailed on this journey, including those I had seen that morning strolling the deck. A few names were marked with a cross. Some people said it again. I saw right away that these were more than labels. They served as warnings or records. I halted as I heard a murmur. "Caleb, don't touch the records," coming from somewhere behind the jacket stacks. The temperature of the air fell. Although the rest of the ship was warm, frost developed along the metal beams. Then I noticed the previously pale figure moving, silently moving across the floor. Unnaturally, its arms spread out as though to embrace the whole room. Even though its eyes were black nothingness, I could feel them staring at me. I took off running. The staircase led me back to the hallways I believed I knew, but it was longer than I had anticipated and curled into impossible angles. Doors to rooms that didn't belong on this deck led onto hallways that folded over themselves. The tapping continued, exact as ever, reverberating through the metal walls like a predator tallying its kills. I tried phoning for assistance in a crew corridor, but the connection was dead. I attempted yelling, banging on doors, and flashing lights. The sole answer was a low, human-sounding, warped laugh from someplace in the vents overhead. The ship had started playing tricks on me, testing and exploiting my dread. I took a deep breath and hid in a supply closet. The gloom was deafening. I saw a piece of paper pinned to a coat hook as I leaned against the wall. In sloppy handwriting it said, "Once you hear the voice, it knows you." I folded the note and stuffed it into my pocket, saying, "Curiosity is no longer an option. All of our instincts told us to get out and run." But the hallways had transformed once more. Steel walls now terminated the hallways leading to the dining hall. Instead of leading to the upper deck, doors opened into infinite black passageways that folded and narrowed like the inside of a living thing. The murmuring came back, more frantic and louder. I pushed onward, eager for sunshine, any hint of escape, as the voices of passengers, staff, and something else entirely overlapped, saying, "Join, stay, follow." I fell into the galley by accident. Plates lay untouched and neatly placed. There was no longer any cooked food odor. I caught a glimpse of folks behind me, dozens of pale faces looking in the gleaming stainless steel of the ovens. I whirled. The galley was deserted. Recalling the viewing deck, I started to run, but was stopped by a person that sprang out of the fog. A hollowed-out replica of Mara stood there. Silently, like though speaking a language I could sense but not hear, her lips twitched. Her feet were surrounded by shadows. Stars that weren't in the sky above were reflected by the ocean's strangely bending and folding horizon behind her. "Caleb," she finally uttered in a warning, tremulous murmur, "you ought not to have arrived here." The vessel never forgets. It provides nourishment. It catches. And it wants. The words were interrupted by a slow, deliberate tapping that started counting again. And it came from all sides this time. The shadows swarmed toward me, gathering into shapes I couldn't identify as they accelerated. I rushed aimlessly, swerving past hallways and doors that led nowhere in an attempt to find anything I knew. The floor beneath me then collapsed. It was a slide rather than a fall, like if the ship had snagged me by the throat. I landed in a dim, chilly room. The air smelled of metal and decay, water pooled down the floor, and rusted pipes dangled from the ceiling. From the darkness came shapes passengers I had seen before, their faces gaunt and pale, their eyes empty. Some drifted softly, while others sought for me. I tried to run away by screaming and beating the walls, but the tapping got louder and echoed in my chest, matching my heartbeat. I felt as though the room was engulfing me in its cramped mouth, stretching in unimaginable ways. The ship had claimed me as its victim, and it was conscious and living. I suddenly came to the terrible realization that the Mariner's Veil did more than merely physically imprison its occupants. It imprisoned their sense of reality itself, as well as their observation and comprehension. Those who heard its voice and went too far out of curiosity became permanently a part of the labyrinth. In my heart, I understood that there was no way out. I stopped watching the time after the fourth night. The Mariner's Veil had devolved into a never-ending labyrinth of winding hallways, impractical stairwells, and doors that led nowhere. Every time I tried to get away, I ended up back on the same balcony and observation deck, looking out over an endless ocean that was dimly lit by a sky that wasn't quite day or night. Like a living heartbeat, the sound of the engines pounded in my chest, reminding me that the ship was alert, patient, and watching. I was no longer searching for additional travelers. Some of them, those hollow-eyed, pallid forms, followed me in silence and vanished when I attempted to speak to them. Others called my name in frantic choruses as they murmured through the vents and voices that were familiar but incorrect. The air had gotten colder, more metallic, and I couldn't get rid of the little copper odor, thick and strange. The fog crept in from the water and curled over the deck like living smoke. Within it, shapes moved, faces, arms, and hands reaching out to me, but they always vanished before I could get close. I felt sick to my stomach when I understood that the ship had done more than simply trap the body. It captured terror, thinking, and attention. It preyed on anyone who paid too much attention. I discovered a hatch that I had not before seen, marked authorized personnel, only with a faint caution. I opened it out of curiosity, a dangerous compulsion. Deeper than any area of the ship I had investigated, a spiral stairway headed down. The steady trickle of water reverberated through the quiet. Overhead, pipes rattled in response to the engine's vibrations. Then, clearly, I heard my name again, emerging from the darkness. Caleb. The stairway stopped in an impossible room. The walls were lined with identical but differingly designed cabins, some basic, some luxurious. Every room was occupied by travelers who were dead, and every door was open. They were captured in periods of normal behavior as they sat, stood, and lay. While some people stared blankly at nothing, others giggled quietly. Above all, there was a slight tapping sound that echoed through the hull, counting methodically. I took my time, feeling shivers down my spine with every step. From one of the rooms came a pale, female, still figure, but I recognized her. "The ship collects," she said, her lips hardly moving, her eyes locking onto mine Mara again, or a mirror of her memory, her presence warning me. The hallways moved around me as I retreated, saying, "The curious are next." The floor gave way under me like water. The walls curled inconceivably, and the doors stretched into eternity. I ran and kept going around corners until I was back on the deck. The sea glistened strangely. Some stars drifted upward as if gravity had failed, while others floated against the flow, reflecting in the water. The tapping increased in speed and proximity. Shapes hissed and muttered as shadows gathered along the railings and rose like black smoke. Desperate for some indication of crew control, rationality, or control, I went to the bridge. There was nobody on the bridge. Only the faint shapes of people who had boarded long ago, stuck in frozen moments, never leaving, were visible on screens that flashed with static. At that time, I realized that the Mariner's Veil had neither a destination nor a schedule. Its sole purpose was to capture, gather, and consume curiosity and dread. The crew was either completely absent or involved. All of the passengers were already caught up in its never-ending cycles. I was, too, now. I tried using a cell, radio, or any other signal for assistance. Nothing. Beyond the railing, the ocean extended indefinitely and without interruption. And I noticed movement in that uninterrupted horizon. A dim shape emerging from the sea, observing unbelievably enormous, almost human. The shadows gathered behind me as I turned away, my heart racing. Pursuing the appearance of escape, I dashed to the bow and sprang across slippery decks. The ship moaned beneath the weight of its impractical design. Hallways stretched. Stairwells and doors twisted even more, and rooms folded in on themselves. I knew I would never again find my cabin. The world I knew will never be the same again. Like the others, I had been claimed by the ship. Nevertheless, I sensed a change in the gloom and fog, a corridor leading to a dim light, a door opening somewhere I hadn't seen before. I wanted to hold out hope, but my gut told me that the light was only another trap, another place where curious people would gather. I stopped, my chest heaving and my breath raspy. My bones resonated with the tapping. I recognized the faces that formed as the shadows moved over the railing, frozen in expectancy and terror. The glass of the doors to the viewing deck reflected me, pale-eyed and waiting. Finally, I realized that the Mariner's Veil was limitless, understanding, and patient. There was no escape. Currency was attention. Fear provided nourishment. And anyone who ventured to observe too closely was irrevocably involved. I moved away from the railing as the darkness drew closer. I realized that no one would believe me when the voice continued, almost calmingly. "Your curiosity, it brought you here." The Mariner's Veil would wait for the next inquisitive person, feeding on the same reckless desire and need to know. And the memory of the ship would still torment me even if I managed to get away. I have no idea how long the hallways will wind, and how long the tapping will go on, or how much longer I can remain conscious. counting, increasing, closing in. 3 sluggish, 1 pause, 2 sharp. I hear it again now. I am already a part of it, so I know. By the 7th night, the fog had grown so dense that the water outside the railing was completely obscured. I was unable to distinguish between the water and the ship. The boards themselves seemed to be alive, mimicking my movements in a cadence that mirrored the tapping I had grown to fear, and every step I took on the deck was amplified. It was now more than just a sound. It was a countdown, a warning, and a heartbeat. I strolled around the hallways looking for something that looked like an exit. Stairwells twisted back into themselves, corridors extended beyond the line of sight, and doors opened onto walls. My flashlight flashed, creating shadows that moved without reference to their surroundings. I was certain I wasn't crazy. The ship was living, evolving, and constantly conscious of me. The footsteps behind me were then audible, deliberate, slow, resonating in a different way than mine. I turned around. The hallway was deserted, but as I rushed, I heard a gentle, enticing murmur. "Caleb, it's time." The stairwells were impossible to bend. The galley was deserted. The cottages were lined with those hollow-eyed people I had seen previously, and they stretched on forever. Some discreetly reached for me, while others just watched. Even though their presence was overpowering, I was unable to turn away. Curiosity had turned into a liability. I fell onto the deck of the promenade. The outline of a figure near the bow was seen as the mist somewhat parted. Pale, expressionless, hands outstretched as though beckoning me. This, I knew immediately, was the last threshold. If I went too close, the ship would completely engulf me, hesitate, and let me be consumed by the darkness. I inhaled nervously and walked over to it. The deck extended endlessly under my feet. The tapping increased in frequency, overlapping and discord, creating a cacophony that made my chest tremble. I looked back and saw doors opening into an unnatural blackness and passageways that seemed to go on forever. Silent expectation paused when figures appeared, the silhouettes of both crew and passengers. Once more, the man at the bow muttered, "You were brought by curiosity." My thoughts screamed as I froze. Fear will keep you. The hum of the ship intensified, echoing through my entire body. If it could still be called that, the seas reflected non-existent stars. The deck behind me was gone, yet I still wanted to turn aside, run, and get out. Only the figure, the mist, and the endless horizon were present. Instinctively, I reached out. Then I was completely engulfed by the mist. I'm not sure if I floated at all, let alone how long. Time lost its significance. All I knew was that it was there, the ship itself, watching, feeding, patient. My pulse was the tapping. Shadows passed through me and along with me. And the figure, it was waiting, watching, everywhere and nowhere. I became acutely aware that the mariner's veil did more than simply ensnare the mind and body. It ensnared the spirit of inquiry. Anyone who had the courage to observe, inquire, or delve too far into it was added to its never-ending collection. My awareness stretched across decks. I could no longer count. My anxiety reverberating endlessly. My own thoughts collapsing into the hallways. "Another joins the collection," was murmured by a familiar yet impossible voice somewhere. Then there was heavy, endless quiet, save for the tapping. Always the tapping, counting, patient, everlasting. I realize now that I might never go, that the ship sails through the people who see it, not the water. Additionally, while you're listening to this story, keep in mind that curiosity is not always a bad thing. It occasionally signals the ship to take notice of you. Occasionally, it's the final action you take. And in the distance, over the murmur of water and steel, I hear the tiniest whisper of my own name, Caleb. The horizon continues, uninterrupted. The ship is waiting, and I'm already involved in it.